Well, back now to one of the main stories tonight. The news that the Education Secretary, Gavin Williamson, has said the system of bubbles for containing coronavirus outbreaks in schools in England is to end. It's led to large numbers of pupils being sent home, hundreds of thousands, in fact, if a single child in their group tests positive. Well, we're going to discuss today's announcement in a little bit more detail with Sammie McFarland, who's founder of the campaign group Long COVID Kids. Also joined by Glyn Potts, who's headmaster of Newman RC College in Oldham. And we can speak to Jeff Barton, General Secretary of the Association of School and College Leaders. Let's start with you, Jeff. Is this a sensible move to end the school bubbles that have caused so much disruption in our schools?
Well, I think there's two dimensions to this, Ben. So if we look at it purely in educational terms, what the data today is telling us is that something like 625,000 children were off school last week. And that's not because they had COVID, it's because they may or may not have come into contact. That is simply unsustainable. And as an association representing school and college leaders, we've said on educational grounds, that has to end. That said, I think quite a lot of people will say, well, we're suddenly moving to something quite different from that, where lots of the restrictions we might have expected have disappeared. Give us the reassurance that both for those young people and also the adults working in those schools, that that is the right big move. And I think we will be wanting a bit more detail about that. But in educational terms, I think we had to end the bubble system. Just bearing in mind, we're not talking about the ending this week or next week. It's not until the 19th. Really important people recognise that.
And just briefly, should we ever have had that system, that school bubble system?
Yes, we had to have it, Ben, because what we had to do was to try and minimise young people having contacts with other young people. And that was one simple way of keeping year groups or classes together. But its time has gone, frankly, and that's why I think we've had the announcement today.
Sammie McFarland, founder of the campaign group Long COVID Kids. What are your concerns about this?
So, I mean, removing the bubbles is a huge concern for us. Bubbles have always been too big. Smaller bubbles would have been helpful, but to remove them completely now leaves children and young people completely at risk. It's Russian roulette for children. We don't know which children are going to get, who get COVID will get long COVID.
But then the alternative is that, as we've seen in the last few days, we just have hundreds of thousands of children, self-isolating and not at school. And that is just a lost generation of children, isn't it? It's not sustainable, is it?
No, that's absolutely right. And we should be looking at how we can keep children in school and really asking why the government aren't funding, HEPA filters, CO2 monitors, looking at how we can improve ventilation in schools to keep them in school, to keep them educated, but also to keep them safe and healthy.
So are you saying that those sort of measures would be an adequate replacement for the bubble system?
That's exactly what we're saying. We need to see robust mitigation measures in schools so that children can be in school, but they can also be protected from a virus, which is a novel virus. We don't know the long-lasting effects. We do know that 8% of the older age group and 7% of the younger age group who get COVID do get long COVID. And from that, we don't know how long it will last for. We know that 9,000 children still have symptoms at 12 months plus, according to the ONS data.
Yeah, but, I mean, we need to get this in perspective, don't we? Because the risk of children becoming seriously ill from the virus is very small, isn't it?
Is it? I don't think if you asked any of the parents in our group that they would say that. We're looking at the ONS data is a brilliant recording service, and we're very grateful for it. But they use 21 symptoms to record how many children are affected by COVID and have long COVID symptoms. But actually, parents are reporting up to 100 symptoms, and so any of the children that are reporting symptoms that aren't in that list of 21, they're not being recorded as continuing with ongoing symptoms. So we suspect that the actual true figures are much higher than the ones that are currently quoted.
Well, let me just quote you, Professor Russell Viner, who's president of the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health, so an absolute expert in this field, says as cases in the community rise, and they are rising, there will be a small increase in the number of children we see with COVID, but the overwhelming majority of children and young people have no symptoms or very mild illness only. What's your response to that?
So, I mean, that's just not what we're seeing. We have 3,000 children in the group, many of whom were ill in the first and second wave, none of whom are getting better. Some of them have made improvements, but they're not yet returned to their previous level of health. And I think we have to be much more curious about the long-lasting effects of COVID on children.
OK, let's go to Glyn Potts, headmaster of the Newman RC College in Oldham. Glyn, what's been your experience of this whole policy of bubbles, and are you glad to see the back of it?
Well, I think I welcome the removal of bubbles for September. I think they were a necessary evil at the time when the virus was rife in the community and we had limited information on the virus and where vaccination was not at such a high level. I think what I would say, though, is I don't disagree with the comments around long COVID and the impact on children, but also, of course, we've got many, many more risks associated with children, not just COVID, and school leaders are balancing those risks on a daily basis. In my school, for the last 4 weeks, I've had nearly 600 children absent, at one point 40% of my teaching staff. Whilst that is considered acceptable by the Department for Education in terms of running a school, it presents many more difficulties for us to manage and far more challenges for our young people. That's not acceptable, and we need to trust school leaders to make the right decisions by their communities and by their young people.
I mean, it's been chaos, frankly, hasn't it, for the last few weeks?
It's certainly felt that way, but I'm blessed to have the hardest working team in education. You make it a joy for me. My young people have been really mature, but they've got concerns, and quite rightly, they want to know that they're going to be protected. But their parents need greater information, and schools need more autonomy to make local decisions with their councils or with their regional governments to make sure that we can do our best by the children. Simply sending children home in large numbers, as we have done for the past 5 weeks in Oldham, puts children at risk. We need a different measure that accepts the risk of COVID, but mitigates other risks as well. Having a one-size-fits approach isn't working for us.
And just give us then some of the ideas you'd like to put into practice, perhaps in your school. We're not going to have this system of bubbles, so what sort of mitigating systems would you like there to help deal with COVID in the future?
Well, I think we've got 8 or 9 weeks now till September. It would be fantastic to see government put significant effort into how they can support schools with testing on our return in the same way that they have done to get sporting events off the ground. I think it would be important and vital that we start to talk about ventilation, as some countries in Europe have already done, to make sure there's greater ventilation.
What do you mean exactly by, when you say ventilation? I think a lot of people don't know exactly what you mean by that. I mean, I know that ventilation is obviously is a key factor, but how do you improve the ventilation in a school?
Well, simply opening a window isn't an option in some schools, and opening a window on a busy road doesn't actually help a child with asthma. So I think we need to talk about whether or not we should be investing in proper ventilation in schools with HEPA filters to make sure that the air that's going into a school is right and appropriate for young people. And secondly, I think we need to ask and start that debate on vaccinating children voluntarily. But clearly, if we want to have the sustainability of education, we need to start having these discussions. Simply waiting to the last minute and forcing on school leaders and asking them to react isn't a plan. And I feel that the trust between government and school leaders has eroded. Now's the time to start to talk about what we need to do.
Let's have that debate about vaccinating children, because it's a good point. Jeff, what is your view on that? Is that part of the solution, to vaccinate our children?
Well, Ben, it might be, but a bit like Glyn, I'm an educationist, and ultimately we will look to the medical profession on that. I think there's a frustration at how long the seriousness of this debate is taking to come to some kind of resolution, and we gather there may be some issue about side effects, there may not be, but it will not be a good look at the very least, will it? If it looks like the adults, those people over 21, have been vaccinated and are going about business as usual, whilst in our schools we start to see young people suffering with all of this. Now, it might not be the case that happens, but I think we either rule out vaccination or we hear that there is a plan for it, as there has been in the USA. And I think that would be one way of giving reassurance to people like Sammie that actually the government is doing more than just giving us rhetoric and actually saying we have a specific plan to protect those young people.
Well, so, Sammie, where do you stand on this? You talked about your concern about long COVID and generally about COVID in children. Where do you stand on the issue of vaccinating children?
I think that the children should be offered vaccines, definitely, but not just the secondary age group, but the primary age group as well, because that's the fastest rise in infections in the younger age group. 28% of hospital admissions in children went up by 28% last week, and we're seeing that rising much faster than in the second wave. So vaccinations are really key, I think, and it should be parental choice.
And Glyn Potts was just talking to us, Sammie, about some of the other things that can be done in schools. Would you like to see more done in terms of ventilation and so on?
Yes, absolutely. As I sort of mentioned in my opening comments, that we need to see ventilation in schools. We need robust mitigation measures now, and definitely before the autumn when children return to school. We've been fundraising for CO2 monitors as a campaign group, and we have a long list of head teachers that have applied for those monitors, but we don't yet have enough funding. So we need to be looking to the government to supply that. That's really their job, not ours.
Glyn, I mean, just talk to us about how much damage do you think has been done to this generation of school children who've lost so much education, so many days, weeks of learning?
Forgive me, I don't want to say that. I don't want to rule out the talent and ability that is in this generation of young people. But what they do need is optimism and hope that they have in abundance if we can present to them a plan that they can engage with. And that's the difficulty we've got now. We're talking about recovery. This has never been about recovery. There are inequalities built in the system. We need an absolutely refreshed system of education. These young people are resilient, mature, and desperate to share their talent. What we need to stop doing is downbeating them and suggesting that somehow they're going to be a lost generation or a generation that will amount to nothing. Nothing could be further from the truth. Come and see my children. They will blow you away. What they need is a clear plan, and students need an opportunity to show it and adults to let them live it.
Well, that's a very good message, and I'm sure they would blow away anybody who comes to see them in your school. Glyn Potts, thank you so much, Headmaster of Newman College in Oldham. Thanks too to Jeff Barton, General Secretary of the Association of School and College Leaders, and Sammie McFarland, founder of Long COVID Kids. Really interesting discussion. Good to talk to all of you. Thank you so much for your time.